cities in terms of skyline. And his conclusion is that one of the distinctive things about cities, one of the things which is different about them, is precisely their skyline. And that differentiates one kind of area, one geography, one economy from another. A second argument, it seems to be, about the tendency for internationalism to make us all placeless, unindividual, and resembling each other, seems to me to be the increasing desire to preserve the past. This is, I think, eloquently documented by David Lowenthal in The Past is a Foreign Country. What forces, then, could we say are in play to suggest that the history of internationalism is indeed brief? It seems to me that there may be 6 forces. The firstly, referring back to Lowenthal and his work, is the conservation movement. The conservation movement, of course, wishes to preserve anything that is old. I mean, there will be no prizes to the first person who starts up the 50s society if it doesn't already exist, and I'm definitely in for the 60s. The notion, that is, that whatever is constructed can be and should be maintained because it is somehow part of our Jungian or other kind of subconscious, and that we haven't got the guts to demolish it and start again. The conservation movement now is extremely strong for whatever reason. This seems to me one force against, to suggest that the history of internationalism is barely that of a century and is over. The second one seems to me to be that as a result of this, the buildings of the past, as a result of the conservation movement, the buildings of the past increasingly are acquiring the status of an archive. That is, not only do we find architectonic and architectural metaphors drifting into all kinds of texts written by all kinds of people, but we also find all kinds of people treating buildings not simply from the outside but also from the inside as something which they wish to see, they wish to visit. One glorious instance seems to me to be the American who has taken over a house around Christchurch Spitalfields and does not use electricity or gas because electricity and gas were not around when the house was constructed. He therefore lives by candlelight and presumably wood fires and maybe a bit of coal. And of course it is interesting to me that it is someone, an American, who wishes to preserve that. I follow Don Bates in thinking that we are all Americans now, probably, at one level. The third force to suggest that internationalism is brief seems to me to be a return to cities in general, certainly in Western Europe, and I think increasingly in America, a return of that population which left in the 50s, that population in the 60s, that population which left when perhaps schooling was appallingly bad, when public transport was awful, and when you couldn't walk out in the streets without coming across a beggar. Now, funnily enough, all of those conditions still exist, in fact more so now, but we are witnessing a new urban population coming in, one which is, if not yuppie, I would think is at least gruppy, that is, grown-up urban professionals. The fourth force seems to me that cities have themselves ceased to be the place where commodities are exchanged and have become not only an agency in the whole exchange of commodities which goes on worldwide. Commodities are not stocked or stored in central London anymore. The only city I know which actually stacks goods in the centre is Lisbon, and the result of it was, of course, the fire last year, because all of the shops on Garrett, on that street that went up, had enormous stocks there and not out of the city. Try going to Selfridges, and if they don't have it in your size, they don't have it. There is no stock held in the shops. The cities, however, cities in Western Europe, it seems to me, have become themselves commodities. This was put to me by the chief planning officer of the chief planner rather of the city of Hamburg, Egbert Cossack, who said, yes, of course, cities are now themselves commodities. They indeed are bought and sold. commodities in the sense of international ownership, perhaps, which also, not only through that ownership pattern, have become identifiable as places to go, places where you take a weekend break. The Grand Tour, I think, has been reborn, and it is being reborn because we actually want now, or there seems to be a significant population who do want to, visit cities as an experience in itself. And it is instructive in this case to recall that 35% of the gross national product of West Berlin comes from tourism. Fifth possible argument, that internationalism is, as it were, over. Cities are, it seems to me, the only places where minority interests have a voice. It is perhaps true that there are many networks, and certainly the gay network is the most obvious, which might connect London, Paris, Berlin, New York, San Francisco, and Amsterdam, and it may be international. But it is distinctly a local operation, can only operate in cities, and it has as only one aspect of it, that aspect which one could call international. It is highly specific in the places in which it is found. It is not international, therefore. The final argument, I think, is that the real internationalism which we now see is not of objects or of cities, but is of media. One could say that the Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank could be built anywhere. And it's interesting that in Frank Duffy's presentation, I think Lloyd's and Hong Kong were mentioned as the key buildings for the London market. But it is, in fact, as a building, one that is an almost direct copy of a prototype developed by Amancio Williams for Buenos Aires in 1949, and that was built in a different form by Carvajal in Madrid, and then later, by 5 years, by Foster, for obviously very national reasons. The Hong Kong Bank, Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank, leading up to, is it 1997, when the Chinese take over, must have had the need to say they are going to keep their money there. And so what better way to do it than to build a building on which the costs have never been released? The forces in favour of internationalism seem to me that to be, one, something to do with building products, with the fact that it's very hard now to get a steel bath here that's made in this country. They're imported from Europe. Secondly, that there is a degree of professional expertise, and I don't just mean star architects, but there is a degree of professional expertise which is to some extent international. Planners like DEGW, engineers perhaps like Peter Rice, and a mobile and changing array of young architects who may as well work in Germany as in London, as in New York, as in Tokyo. And I'm thinking of the Australian Peter Wilson in Munster, the Iranian Zaha Hadid working in London but building in Hamburg and Tokyo, the Swiss Bernard Schumi. I don't have a thing about the Swiss, don't think that because I keep saying Swiss I have a thing. The Swiss Bernard Schumi, Dean at Columbia in New York, building in Paris, Tokyo, and I'm not quite sure where else. The other force for internationalism in this game, obviously, is the architectural press. I don't mean you, Colin. I mean that there are 5 major magazines in the world through which architecture is disseminated. The Architectural Review, Architecture and Urbanism from Japan, Progressive Architecture from America, and Domus from, but no longer Casabella sadly, from Italy, and L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, if it gets its act together, from Paris. These are not necessarily the best, but they are all chasing the same projects, and they are all publishing pretty much the same projects. And from time to time, they up the intellectual status because the deputy editor interviews Jacques Derrida, or other figures. The fourth force for internationalism seems to me that we have in this description of internationalism all the components of an institution. And I can assure you that once you get heavily involved with institutions, as I am up the road, you realize what the inside of a mortuary looks like. That is, that it has products, it has professionals, it has publications, and it has an educational program and procedure. All of these forces, however, for internationalism seem to me to be reactive. They are unlike the congruence, joying of Art Nouveau and Belgian socialism. They are quite unlike that in that they are subject to no forces, subject to no program, I'm sorry, and certainly to none which enabled Gropius, as I mentioned earlier, to coin the phrase international architecture in very bad on dates, 1925. Movements, of course, have become international. This should make us think that probably the era of internationalism is over. First of all, there was that movement which Charles Jenks, I've completely forgotten its name, and then there was, now there is deconstruction, which is, you know, it's quite I think it's a very amusing thing. And I think that we'll have more international examples. But this is not part of the objective of either that movement, whose name I forget, nor of deconstruction. It's not part of their objective to be international. They are merely, I suspect, an accidental effect of the media, an accidental effect of international publishing. These arguments, I think, about the forces of internationalism for and against are probably applicable to all of the arts and culture. I don't think time permits to give examples on that. It's certainly the fact that there are clear cases in music, art, and literature. Though, of course, translation itself always presents problems. But the media through which the arts have greatest public exhibition, television, it seems to me, is at one level deeply, deeply national. It is the case, for example, that while we have currently, I think, 3 arts programs, at the moment, America, the United States thereof, has no national arts program on its television networks. TV, it seems to me, is deeply national, despite the evidence of Dallas. The technique of the talking head in television forbids subtitles, and the only way that an international program could at all be made is if you use voiceovers and only voiceovers. In publishing, another example, with the coming of 1992, we find many people currently thinking about a European arts magazine, if not a European architecture magazine. It is, for example, part of the prospectus for Architecture Today, and I'm told will be part of the prospectus for Jonathan Glancy's World Architecture. But 2 forces seem to me to mitigate against the success of either project as a European, simply European magazine. Firstly, the EEC contains as many language communities, as countries, in fact more officially. And secondly, building product manufacturing is far from even EEC-wide. Not surprising, given the high cost of transport of heavy goods. Therefore, there's no advertising base for a European-wide magazine of substance. And if we recall some of the figures of publication for example, Dunster, which I believe sells around about 80,000, only 4,000 copies are sold in America. This is quite remarkable, considering that America has an enormous population of architects, all eager to get glossies, it always seems to me, but that, in that country, PA, which sells, I think, 90,000 there, sells, I think, a total of 2,500 in Europe. So the two mitigating factors, perhaps, against the media, which I am not blaming, I'm merely making an observation, which seem to me to be at the root of the notion of internationalism or nationalism. The media seem to me to offer some really serious problems. And yet, it seems to me in conclusion, I would say that if there is any future for internationalism, the model which I must suggest, paradoxically, is that of Hollywood. It is absolutely crucial, if internationalism is to continue in any serious way, it seems to me that we must have a star system. Economic forces may be defeated in the next instance, I think, by the forces of popular culture and by Burt Lancaster and Sophia Loren. Thank you.
Right. I wonder who it is now.
Can that screen this?
Yes, you
don't
need
sort of
to
blink at the phone. No, that's nice. There's no on the screen now. Just I get bored out. You want to see out the window.
Lines up. If you know that you're the guest, aren't you? You're the guest, so you want me to use this. Right. Well, we're going. The last presentation to the meeting is going to be by Cedric Price. Cedric Price is always, for me, an extremely difficult person to introduce because I know how much he dislikes introductions. So I have a sort of habit of, from time to time, sort of introducing him without one. And we have to make a big assumption when we do that what you all are very familiar with Cedric Price, which I'm sure you all are, and that in any case he doesn't sort of approve of sort of historical account of his activities, nor of his, nor of what has been accomplished, which is a vast amount by him over the last, dare I say, 20 or so years. Anyway, so let me just introduce you to Cedric Price. Tell you that at the last hearing, his title was Thoughts Beyond Nationalism, but it may be something quite different now. Cedric Price.
Thank you very much. Fine. Well, it of course is very different now because it has altered through the fact that I've sat and listened to a large proportion of this conference. And the whole point of the conference, as outlined in Roy Landau's original blurb, was to arrive at some sort of, let me quote it, to provide productive exchange. Now that's almost over, except for the last session. And so I would like to start by introducing myself, 32 years as a practitioner, and therefore extraordinarily partial, and not really an observer of other people's doings all that much. And therefore I shall, because you are the observers, you have in fact, both from this rostrum and in the discussions, have chewed up and taken away and stored up various pieces of evidences over the centuries and of quotations and the rest. I shall add some more and draw no conclusions because you do in fact have the plenary session to put my contribution in its place and the door marked exit is clearly shown. Now, but so far that the chaps, the papers, the exposés, seem to have exposed in different ways the rather naive reasoning behind architectural efforts related to the production of an internationality or nationality or internationality. I'm going to call it N and in from now on. Producing such works. And it was also brought to the fact that it contrasts quite sharply with actual manifestations of N and IN, coming in manners and language, together with particular reactions to similar political and climatic situations, all of which may spawn architectural markers. A good example of that is that for decades, when pipelines, dangerous pipelines, were put under the ground in whatever country, there were warning signs in the appropriate language that a pipeline had just been put under this field, etc., etc. Nowadays, internationally, the warning signs are a fluorescent orange flag, which can be photographed by survey aircraft, whatever the nationality of the pilot. And people somehow know that there's trouble under that point because there's an orange flag. That's what I mean about markers. Now, or they soon learn. Now, back to architecture. The use of N and IN as a sort of definer of the good to avoid interference by others links naivety with cunning and should be noted in order to be excluded from the useful as far as this conference is concerned. Another quotation, well, another situation. A rather extraordinarily conservative, but very adept at making money, developer called Olympia in York. Notice the name. Where do you place that? They are, in fact, Canadians. Done a lot of work in Hawaii. However, Olympia in York take over an area, docklands. Now, we know one thing about docklands. That is a lie. There are no dockers there, there are no ships there, they're not docks, there are no cranes. That's when the name was adapted, and that's when that silly little logo came out. So that was ideal land for something like Olympia and York. So in their scheme, they produced initially a scheme which has, we won't go into the style of architecture, rather horrific buildings, which they compared with great accuracy, and in fact quoted Sir John Summerson, often misquoted, to the whole tradition of the Georgian Street and the Georgian Square in London. Right, they've got that. But there was water, there was the leftover bits of docks that they hadn't put car parking underneath. That was compared with Venice. Then, in fact, living culture was brought in by getting the ex-director of the V&A and a man who loves writing about cooking and fiddling around with his own garden as advisor on landscape, Roy Strong. So there was a certain amount of history there, tradition and grass. And then, having got these trees planted, they referred to the resultant streets as tree-lined boulevards with arcades enabling Viennese-style coffee shops. However, this possibly was going overboard. They'd worked through Europe a bit much, but they had to appreciate that such a massive development mustn't miss out on the 20th century and the internationalism which you have so brilliantly organized. So the nearest thing to bringing in the ad man or television was to engage, this is only a reputed engagement, the two, I don't know how they would see them, Olympia and York. It's difficult to see anything in perspective from Toronto, but they suggest that it has been suggested that Richard Rogers and Norman Foster work together on two blocks, but together, not one block and one another, but both together on 2 blocks. Now, that is an interesting diminution of the worthwhileness of IN, I would have thought. However, let's get on. Now, Roy Landau's reference in discussion in IN, that the real discussion was conducted outside, or possibly was conducted outside in politics and the media, suggests that even further reference back to the root sources of such discussion, whether it's briefs or initial design approach, in the UK and elsewhere, might be useful at this stage. So I am laying myself open. We're going right back to my sort of attitude to briefs and to the sort of thing the sort of response I have. 1 out of 100,000 architects, but you happen to have been landed with me this afternoon. We'll start with something that hasn't happened yet. I have a meeting called by my clients, British Rail, next week, and they've asked me, prior to such a meeting, to write out, and there's a space about that big, would I write my design philosophy and my design approach. I don't know if they meant me to cross one or the other out, but I wrote both, you see. And this is in relation, it doesn't matter what it's in relation to. They've asked me to write that. Let's see. So my design philosophy is transportation intervals enrich the acceleration from one front door to the other. Full stop. Now, my design approach obviously has to be more constructive. Good railway architecture is that in which the long-term aims do not distort the frequency of beneficial short-term growth or change. The former should not encourage one-off expensive follies, nor the latter be seen as an excuse for cost-cutting and the second rate. Right. However, it isn't always clients that ask for your opinions. Sometimes you just have to write them and see if someone prints them. Here's another one. Bear in mind that at least I am one of the contributors to the subject matter. There is the word architecture at the end of this, isn't there, Roy? Oh, yes, good. Right. Right. Another definition. Style, through conscious action, exercises choice in the use of resources to translate the mundane into the generous. Almost getting to the end of quotations. Harvest of Quiet Hour, selection of scientific quotations collected by Alan Mackay. Cedric Price. Oh, I'm glad they haven't put a death date in. Birth. Cedric Price. The reason for architecture is to encourage people to behave mentally and physically in ways they had previously thought impossible. Now, if we get back to briefs. Let's take well, let's refer to, I think, was it Rusche or someone? I hope this isn't being taped, because we never write it out. But I was very interested in that quotation, that only the city that actually puts defences around itself can afford to behave as if defenceless. That's a paraphrasing of Rusche, presumably via Barrington. Now, in relation to that, and whether I or IN occur, 1961, one received a brief for a bird cage in London. The birds were to be foreign, the visitors were to be international. The users had little visual acuity, except for food and bumping into things. And at a distance, the occupants, who were also the users, didn't make much of a show. However, such a building could respond to heavy winds. Again, the users, the birds, didn't mind if the shape distorted, particularly, as long as the food was there. And the site was twofold, had two demands. Or I suppose the rest of the brief was the site had to answer two questions. One, it had to accommodate the building, and two, it had to stop Primrose Hill slipping into the canal. There was another requirement, which was minimum maintenance. Never mind the capital cost, minimum maintenance. There was another requirement that foolhardy school children should be allowed to walk through the aviary, carrying all the resultant risks thereby doing. They should be allowed to walk through the aviary, though they could look at birds quite easily from outside. Anyone should be allowed to walk through. And the last one was that the real users, the occupants, the birds, shouldn't in any way be disturbed from mating and nesting, because it was a scientific institution. Now, that was it. However, something came into my mind in 1961, a delight in using, never mind the materials, and never mind the system, the interest in tubes. And probably the most intricate bit of, one of the most intricate bits of design was making a 2-foot diameter tube that wasn't available in this country and wasn't allowed to be imported. And we made it out of extrusions and welded them together. So, well, think on it. The other thing is that point again, I think made by Barrington, was that in the French dictionary, nationality, one of the definitions was common aspirations. Now, in my profession, I share very few common aspirations with any other architect I know. This does not upset me, but I certainly do not feel myself a member of a gallant band against who all the rest of society is raised. I think most other members of my profession, are for the birds. However, I would like to draw your attention back to serious matters, and that is an issue of architectural design of 1969, where a number of very distinguished people were asked, it was called Treasure Island. And Treasure Island was all about the United Kingdom. And they were asked to pick their favourite bit, their favourite part, and explain why. And I will quote two distinguished persons, the first being Roy Landau. That was the only brief. Roy Landau, Ram Mill, Hague's Textiles, Oldham, Lancashire. A cotton mill still driven by steam power in a declining, on the way out to disappearing industry. A working anti-monument, soon ready for demolition and never to become an anachronism. Why then bother to mention it? Because even in the past, some architecture was built to do a job and then pulled down again. Royal Fine Arts Commission, please note. Here a tradition developed that was direct, energy conserving. Recent mills have scarcely found better organizations. Constructionally minimal, anti-doctrinal, yet designed with enough redundancy to allow, in similar mills, major changes in use. What went wrong with the modern movement? Oldham doesn't know. Then the other, so I've got an eye on the time, is by Cedric Price. He chose a cleared area near the Mancunian Way, Moss Side, Manchester. And his reasons was the nearest thing to a clean slate, if not negative positivism. No natural resources, no unadulterated natural beauty, no contours, no rivers or coastline, no man-made useful and or lovely artifacts, no monuments or relics, no wildlife, no topsoil, no people, little artifactual servicing, little fresh air, little sun, little opportunity for cross-pollination, little reason for being there at present. The surface of the moon is more peculiar and therefore far more likely to occasion overheated artifactual attention. Now, transference of assumptions on other sort of national basis in aspect to architecture, I'd just like to describe two instances. One, we're designing and building soon, I hope, a greenhouse, a Parc de Villette in Paris. And we've just completed a 4-year, reasonably successful program for raising money and letting 400-fold numbers of public into the gardens and park at Stowe School in Buckinghamshire, which at one time was second only to Versailles in both area and numbers of follies, lengths of avenues, lakes, etc., etc. Started very long time ago, but largely worked on by Vanbrugh and by Capability Brown. Now, in the discussions with the locals, and it has a local church in the middle and things, it was interesting that having gone through all the questions of access for the blind, farmers' rights, the local community, do you let motorbikes in? Because people always think of motorbikes now having young owners, but there are lots of old owners and motorbikes, and all that, having done all that, the only real thing that upset the numerous committees we had, and thing that I quite agreed with, but saw no way that architecture could solve it, was that they said, on no account do we want organized parties of French school children. And any other group of schools, anything, but on no account. And when I asked about this, they said they come with pocket knives, Swiss scout knives and things, and they take the eye out of that. So we replace that statue time and time again, that lad one, and they take the eyeball out because it's glass. They take bits off the mosaic thing. They cut, they destroy. No French people say. I said, well, I don't know how you write that into the guidebook, but that's your problem. But the interesting thing, at the same time, I was designing this, or originally designing the thing at Parc de Villette. There was in the brief. There was no mention of French school children, but in the brief there was constant reference to control, to numbers, to different people at different hours, to the public domain and to the invited domain, to barriers and things like that, all written in the brief, quite without any guidance from me. Whereas at Stowe, what I was doing was trying to put curbs that didn't show, but that blind people in wheelchairs or blind people with sticks would feel, etc., etc. We're trying to invent the invisible. Indeed, we have a system whereby if certain paths are worn down through vast popularity in millions of feet, we can, in fact, any time during the year, flood that area so that it looks unsavory to walk over, and they will walk elsewhere. We have little secret sluices because we've got enough water in that area. So so it all looks natural, you know. Nasty rain again, they say, after 3 days like that. So, but in a way, that is I suppose it's speculation, and I'll finish with just a little bit of speculation. Again, in relation to a type. Frank talked about office types and things. It interests me that railway stations tend to, whether national or international, they tend to advertise destinations. There are lots, if you think of Victoria, but if you think of somewhere like Frankfurt, where carved in the thing, all around, are the places you get to. Most of the names are not in the country of generation, they're not in Germany. And airports, with a few exceptions, the early ones, tend to advertise means of travel. Take O'Hare, where there is no chance on any of the signboards troubles or anything of finding anything other than the carrier, other than the airline that's taking you. That just interests me a little bit. Another thing that interests me a little bit is that there's a great thing in admirable journal, Building Design, last week, or the week before. Tend to look the same each week. The study about the development in Docklands. And a new fellow who is now, anyhow, they formed a great design group that's going to improve, let's get it right in the Royals this time, headline, you know, and all that. LDC, a point design panel thing. But what interested me was that the only role model the panel has to follow in this country is the Cardiff Bay Development Corporation. Well, that may be right or it may be wrong, but there are things like Tokyo Bay, Bremerhaven-Bremen link, Hamburg and all its docks. There are cities all over the world with the same tasks going on as at Dockland. This is a typical difficult chance for our design team because all they've got to look at is Cardiff Bay. That strikes me a bit fun as well. And this whole business of the frontier, the difference between the frontier and the suburb, coming back to your thing about the city, I think I was very cheered to be asked some weeks ago, only when later did I find out that I was the alternative to Waldheim, who many of the... It's very interesting. This town in Graz, which I don't think anyone would know of, apart from opera buffs, had not someone like Peter Cook discovered it a few years ago as a centre of, well, apart from discovering Australian architecture. And the thing is that Graz is very interesting. It's about 220,000 people, sort of half Nottingham. It puts it in shape, doesn't it? And there are 120 firms of architects. So, apart from tourism, architecture is the second largest industry. and they all loathe each other. Now, the thing is that the local government gave a great deal of money for setting up a thing which was an idea of a few of these, 3 or 4 small new firms, bright firms, to set up a thing called House of Architecture. The local authority gave them a lovely house, great big budget, posters and things like that, and then they wrote off to all the 120 firms and say, put on exhibitions, lectures and things, you see, but they must be joint, they must be themed. You're not doing single advert for any firm. And of the 120, about 110 firms wrote back and said, we wouldn't have anything to do with those other 10, don't want it. But the 10 were the organisers, so the 10 are the exhibitors. And there's that wonderful thing. And they started doing their display, and I'll come on to the subject of the display, because that's the point. Anyhow, they started doing their display, then it was heard that the city was so proud they thought they'd have the president open it, Waldheim. At which moment, 9 of the 10 firms say, we're taking everything out if he opens it. You see, forget it. And that's why Buggins was brought in. I never saw the correspondence until after. However, the exhibition is on periphery. Full stop. Now, the interesting thing is the definition of what periphery is about does, in fact, just through the word, does in fact raise a whole lot of varied translations as to, you know, there's the House of Architecture and there's the exhibition periphery. I think that's brilliant. I don't know of any, I mean, it really, it's up amongst the, you know, the heights, the best years of the ICA in Dover Street sort of level. It's very good. So I like that. That's worth thinking about. Right. Now, time is up. So what I'm suggesting is a suggestion. You've had lots of suggestions, 2 days. But I suggest that real N and IN in architecture is only recognized through an awareness of the ending of its aptness. Indeed, by the time the commentators, the media, the observers, the chroniclers recognize it, it has become merely the harmless deceiver. However, the act generally goes unnoticed. And to finish with probably Punch's best one-line joke ever, which was, "Listen, the wireless has stopped." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cedric. How much do I owe you?
Well, I tried to get it back on time because you're the only person who ran out of time. You remember, right at the first one. We've got it back almost.
Now, we're going to have a break now for 15 or so minutes.